She sat at her desk, staring at the email on her screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she couldn't bring herself to type a response. The words in front of her blurred slightly, though she had read them over and over again. "We appreciate your hard work and dedication. However, after careful consideration, we have decided to move forward with another candidate for the promotion." She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay composed. It wasn't like she hadn't prepared for this possibility. She had known the competition would be tough. But deep down, she had believed this time would be different. This time, they would finally see her, recognize everything she had done. Instead, they had overlooked her. Again, around her, the office buzzed with activity. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, quiet conversations hummed in the background. No one seemed to notice the storm brewing inside her. She had given years of her life to this company. Stayed late, arrived early, taken on projects no one else wanted. She had put in the work, gone above and beyond. And yet, when it mattered most, they had chosen someone else. Someone who, she knew, hadn't worked nearly as hard. She clenched her fists under the desk, trying to suppress the frustration rising in her chest. It wasn't just about the promotion. It was about what it represented. The validation. The acknowledgement that she was more than just reliable, more than just someone who kept things running smoothly in the background. She blinked a few times, pushing back the sting behind her eyes. She refused to let this break her. A familiar voice snapped her out of her thoughts. "Tough break, huh?" She looked up to see a colleague leaning against the partition, arms crossed. Their tone was casual, almost sympathetic, but she could hear the underlying condescension. She forced a tight smile. "Yeah." They shrugged. "Guess you just have to try harder next time." She nodded, but inside, something shifted. Try harder. She had already given more than anyone else. More than was ever asked of her. And yet, they still didn't see her as someone capable of leading. Maybe the problem wasn't her effort. Maybe the problem was that she had been waiting for someone else to decide she was ready, when in reality, she had been ready all along. As her coworker walked away, she glanced back at the email. The words that had stung so deeply just moments ago suddenly didn't feel like a rejection. They felt like a challenge. If they wouldn't give her a seat at the table, she would build her own. She straightened her posture, inhaling deeply. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. They had no idea what was coming. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment that had led to this. The extra hours, the sacrifices, the times she had swallowed her frustration and kept going because she believed it would all pay off. She had been patient. She had been loyal. And yet here she was, overlooked once again. The next morning she walked into the office with a quiet determination. If they didn't see her value now, she would make them see it. Not by begging, not by waiting, but by proving beyond any doubt that she was the one driving results. She started paying closer attention to how decisions were made, who held influence, and what really kept the company running. It didn't take long to realize a simple truth. The people at the top depended on her more than they realized. She kept everything running smoothly. She was the one colleagues turned to when they needed answers, when projects stalled, when problems needed fixing. She wasn't just another employee. She was the glue holding everything together. So she stopped waiting for permission. Instead of seeking approval, she made moves on her own. She took charge of projects without being asked. She found ways to improve processes that no one else had even noticed. She made herself indispensable at first. No one seemed to notice. But slowly, the dynamic began to shift. Managers started relying on her more. Executives sought her input. People who had once overlooked her were now asking for her opinion. But the most surprising change was in herself. She no longer needed their recognition the way she once had. She wasn't waiting for validation. She was creating her own path then. Something unexpected happened. A major project won, that could determine the company's future was starting to fall apart. The person leading it, the very person who had been chosen over her for the promotion, was struggling. Deadlines were slipping, clients were growing frustrated, and leadership was starting to panic, and that's when she made her move. She didn't gloat, didn't point fingers. Instead, she stepped in and did what she did best. She solved problems. She streamlined communication, identified weak spots, and put things back on track. Quietly, efficiently, she took control. At first, the project lead resisted, but when it became clear that she was the only one holding things together, even they had to admit she was the reason everything hadn't collapsed. Word spread quickly. People noticed. Leadership noticed. And suddenly, the same executives who had once overlooked her were paying very close attention. But she wasn't done yet. Because now, she had a choice. She could wait for them to acknowledge what she had done, to finally offer her the position she had already proven she deserved. Or she could take things even further. She had spent years making this company successful. Now, for the first time, she was asking herself a different question. Did she really need them? Because if she had built all of this for them, what could she build for herself? She sat in the dim glow of her laptop screen, the soft hum of the city outside her window, barely registering in her mind. The weight of everything she had built for this company pressed down on her. But for the first time, she wasn't just thinking about them. She was thinking about herself. For years, she had poured her energy into making things work, solving problems, smoothing over conflicts, ensuring success. And now, as she watched the pieces shift in her favor, a question kept nagging at her. Was this really where she wanted to be? The company had overlooked her before, and they could do it again. Even if they finally saw her value now, it was only because they needed her. What happened when things stabilized? Would they go back to ignoring her contributions, assuming she would always be there, always willing to do the work without recognition? Her phone buzzed with a message. "Can we talk?" It was from the same executive who had passed her over for the promotion, the same one who had watched her fix the project that was on the verge of failure. She stared at the screen for a moment before typing back, "Tomorrow." That night, she barely slept. Not because of nerves, but because her mind was already planning. The next morning, she walked into the office with the same quiet confidence she had built over the past few months. People looked at her differently now. The whispers had started. They knew she was the one keeping things together. The meeting was in a glass-walled conference room, the kind where decisions were made by people who had once dismissed her. She took a seat, watching as the executive shifted in his chair. "We appreciate everything you've done," he started, his tone carefully measured. "Your leadership during the project. It didn't go unnoticed." She didn't react, just waited. "We want to offer you a new role. More responsibility. More visibility." He leaned forward, a chance to step up in an official capacity. It was exactly what she had once wanted. But now, she wasn't sure it was enough. "What does that mean?" she asked. "Well, we're looking at restructuring," he said, choosing his words carefully. "There's an opportunity for you to be more involved in decision-making. We see you as a key part of the future of this company. A key part, but not in charge, not with real power." She thought about the late nights, the sacrifices, the way they had only noticed her when things started falling apart. She thought about how they had chosen someone else before, someone who had nearly tanked an entire division before she stepped in to clean up the mess. And that's when she knew. They needed her more than she needed them. "I'll think about it," she said smoothly, standing up before he could push any further. As she walked out of the conference room, something inside her shifted completely. She wasn't just trying to prove herself anymore. She was deciding her next move. And this time, she was the one in control. As she walked out of the conference room, her mind was racing, but her steps remained steady. The offer they had given her was meant to keep her in place, to make her feel important without actually giving her control. She saw right through it. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Another message, but this one wasn't from the executive. It was from someone she hadn't spoken to in a while, someone who had once worked at the company, but had left to start something of their own, heard about the mess you cleaned up. Let's talk. She hesitated for only a second before replying. When tonight? My office, something about the timing felt too perfect to ignore that evening. She stepped into a sleek but minimalist office space on the other side of the city. The person waiting for her was someone she had always respected, someone who had left because they had seen the same flaws in the company that she was only now starting to admit to herself. "I'm just going to get straight to it," they said, motioning for her to sit. "I know you. I know your work. And I know exactly how much they've undervalued you. So here's the question, why are you still there?" She exhaled, staring at the skyline through the wide glass windows. It was the same question she had been asking herself for weeks. "I don't know," she admitted. "Well, I do," they said. "Because they made you believe you had to prove yourself to them. But you don't. You've already done that. And now you have two choices. You can stay and wait for them to give you a fraction of what you actually deserve. Or..." She turned to look at them, the pause making her pulse quicken. "Or you can walk away and build something of your own." The weight of those words settled over her, heavy but thrilling. "I'm expanding," they continued. "And I need someone like you. Someone who knows how to lead, how to fix problems, how to take things to the next level. Someone who isn't afraid to stop waiting and start owning." A job offer. But not just any job. This wasn't another role where she had to prove herself all over again. This was a chance to be at the top from day one. Her mind flashed back to the company she had spent years giving everything to. The long nights. The constant uphill battles. The way they had only noticed her when it suited them. And now, when they finally wanted to keep her, it was only because they were afraid of losing her. She had the power now, but was she ready to use it? She stood up, gripping the arms of the chair for just a second longer than necessary. "Give me 24 hours. A small smile. A knowing nod. "Take your time. But I think you already know what you want." And they were right. She did. But she also knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to leave quietly. The next morning, she walked into the office with a sense of calm she hadn't felt in years. Today wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about seeking approval. It was about making a choice and making sure they knew exactly why she was making it. The executive who had offered her the promotion was already waiting in the conference room, his expression unreadable. He motioned for her to sit, but she remained standing, placing a neatly printed letter on the table between them. "What's this?" he asked, picking it up with a slight frown. "My resignation." His eyes snapped up to meet hers. "You're leaving?" She nodded, watching as the words sank in. He had expected her to take the offer, to be grateful for the crumbs they had finally decided to throw her way. He hadn't expected this. "Look," he started, leaning forward, "I know you weren't happy about being passed over before. But this is your chance to step up. Things are changing. You don't have to leave." She tilted her head slightly. "You're right. I don't have to. But I want to." Silence stretched between them. "You're making a mistake," he said finally, voice measured but tight. "You've built something here. If you walk away now, all that work was mine," she interrupted. "And you didn't see it until you had no choice. I don't need to stay somewhere just because I built something. I can build again. And this time, it'll be on my terms." A flicker of frustration crossed his face, but before he could speak again, she reached into her bag and pulled out a second folder. "This," she said, sliding it toward him, "is my final contribution. A full transition plan. The team is in good hands. I made sure of that. Because unlike some people in this company, I don't believe in leaving a mess behind for someone else to clean up. He looked at the folder, then back at her. She could see the wheels turning, the realization settling in that he had lost more than just an employee. He had lost the person who had been holding everything together. She turned to leave, but before she reached the door, he spoke again. "Where are you going?" She paused, then glanced over her shoulder. "Somewhere that doesn't require me to keep proving my worth," and with that, she walked out, not just of the conference room, but of the company she had spent years building. The air outside felt different, lighter. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, her phone buzzed. A simple message, "Welcome to the team. Let's make something incredible." A small smile played on her lips. She had spent years waiting for them to see her. But now, she was the one calling the shots. She stepped outside, feeling the warmth of the sun against her skin. It was strange how something as simple as walking out of a building could feel like shedding an entire lifetime. The weight that had been pressing on her for years was gone, replaced by something new. Freedom. Her phone vibrated again. Another message from her new team. They had already set up a meeting for the afternoon. She had barely left her old job, and yet the next chapter was already unfolding. It felt different. It felt right. As she made her way to a nearby cafe, she let herself reflect. There had been so many times when she thought staying was her only option, that if she worked hard enough, waited long enough, someone would finally recognize her worth. But that wasn't how it worked. The truth was, she had always been enough. The company had just never been the right place for her to thrive. A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see an old colleague, someone she had worked alongside for years, but who had always kept quiet when promotions were handed out unfairly. They looked at her, hesitant at first. "So it's true. You're really leaving?" She nodded, watching as they shifted on their feet. They exhaled, searching for the right words. "I hope you know that a lot of us saw it. The work you did. How much you carried. They hesitated again, before finally admitting, "We should have spoken up." She let the words settle between them, before offering a small smile. "It's okay. I spoke up for myself. And that's what matters now." They nodded, seeming relieved, but there was something else in their eyes. A realization. Maybe even inspiration. And for the first time, she saw what she hadn't noticed before. She wasn't just leaving. She was making others rethink their own paths. She spent the next few days transitioning out of her role, making sure her team was prepared for the shift. The executives barely acknowledged her departure, beyond the usual formalities, but she didn't care. Their approval no longer mattered. When she walked into her new office, a space filled with energy, collaboration, and people who actually listened, she knew she had made the right choice. This wasn't just a new job. It was a fresh start. Weeks passed, and word got around. Some of her old colleagues started reaching out, not just to congratulate her, but to ask how she had done it. How she had found the courage to walk away. The irony wasn't lost on her. The company that had overlooked her had unknowingly created something bigger. Momentum. The people they had underestimated were now realizing their own potential. And then one day, she got an email. A familiar name. One of the executives. The subject line was simple: "Let's talk." She opened it, scanning the words carefully. They wanted to meet. To discuss potential opportunities. She leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the desk. Once upon a time, she might have rushed to accept. But now, she saw it for what it was. They didn't respect her back then. They simply hadn't expected to need her. She took a deep breath and started typing. "Thank you for reaching out. At this time, I'm focused on building something of my own. Wishing you all the best." She hit send, feeling nothing but certainty. She had spent years waiting for them to notice her. Now, she was too busy building a future where she no longer needed their recognition. And that was the real victory. Staying was her only option. That if she worked hard enough, waited long enough, someone would finally recognize her worth. But that wasn't how it worked. The truth was, she had always been enough. The company had just never been the right place for her to thrive. A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see an old colleague, someone she had worked alongside for years, but who had always kept quiet when promotions were handed out unfairly. They looked at her, hesitant at first. "So it's true. You're really leaving?" She nodded, watching as they shifted on their feet. They exhaled, searching for the right words. "I hope you know that a lot of us saw it. The work you did. How much you carried. They hesitated again, before finally admitting, "We should have spoken up." She let the words settle between them, before offering a small smile. "It's okay. I spoke up for myself, and that's what matters now." They nodded, seeming relieved, but there was something else in their eyes. A realization, maybe even inspiration. And for the first time, she saw what she hadn't noticed. Before, she wasn't just leaving. She was making others rethink their own paths. She spent the next few days transitioning out of her role, making sure her team was prepared for the shift. The executives barely acknowledged her departure beyond the usual formalities, but she didn't care. Their approval no longer mattered. When she walked into her new office, a space filled with energy, collaboration, and people who actually listened, she knew she had made the right choice. This wasn't just a new job. It was a fresh start. Weeks passed, and word got around. Some of her old colleagues started reaching out, not just to congratulate her, but to ask how she had done it. How she had found the courage to walk away. The irony wasn't lost on her. The company that had overlooked her had unknowingly created something bigger momentum. The people they had underestimated were now realizing their own potential. And then one day, she got an email. A familiar name. One of the executives. The subject line was simple: "Let's talk." She opened it, scanning the words carefully. They wanted to meet. To discuss potential opportunities. She leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the desk. Once upon a time, she might have rushed to accept. But now, she saw it for what it was. They didn't respect her back then. They simply hadn't expected to need her. She took a deep breath and started typing. "Thank you for reaching out. At this time, I'm focused on building something of my own. Wishing you all the best." She hit send, feeling nothing but certainty. She had spent years waiting for them to notice her. Now, she was too busy building a future where she no longer needed their recognition. And that was the real victory.